Hello everyone and welcome back to Ruby Lessons in Code Academy. So in the last lesson we finished with the first section of the course, and today we're going to start the section of the course that's about control or flow control or control flow, whichever way you want to call it. So this is basically when you tell the program, depending on this, do this. And so it's basically making decisions depending on the things that you have. So you may have noticed that the kinds of programs we've written so far in Ruby aren't very flexible. Sure, they can take the user's input, but they always produce the same result, which we don't really always want to do that, based on that input. They don't change their behavior in reaction to the environment or the collection of variables and their values that exist in the program at a given time. Control flow gives us the flexibility we're looking for. We can select different outcomes depending on information the user types, the result of a computation, or the value returned by another part of the program, or what a variable is depending on what the user's entered, so that if they've entered 0, we can make one decision, greater than or less than 0, some other decision, for example. Excuse me. Instructions. So what we need to do is check out the code in the editor. This is basically what we're going to be learning about. So if you think about the code that's in the editor in English, let's go in it line by line. Print integer please. So we're going to be asked for some input. And the next line gets our input. And because input is entered as a string, so this gets a string, we want to convert it into a number because we're going to be working with numbers. Therefore we do integer and then put brackets around what gets the input, so gets.chomp. So whatever we enter gets converted into an integer. So far so good. Then we have if user number, so the number that the user has entered is less than 0. So if something is less than 0, then do this. Otherwise, else if, so else if means otherwise, the number is greater than 0, do this. Else, so in any other case, think of it in English, so else in any other case, you picked 0 is the output. And then end, well, we're ending the thing that we have been doing. Okay, so let's move on and look at it in a bit more depth. So let's enter an integer. If I enter 0, oh, why haven't these two been printed? Well, that's because we have a whole block of code and it's not all singular. So if this doesn't get executed, then this doesn't get executed either because it's false. Only this gets executed. The parts before don't get run, basically. So let's actually explain this a bit more by looking at what the course has. Ruby's if statement takes an expression, which is just a fancy word for saying something that has a value. Anything, basically. A string, a boolean, an integer, a float. So if that expression is true, Ruby executes the block of code that follows it. If it's not true, so that is if it's false, Ruby doesn't execute that block of code. It skips it and goes on to the next thing, which is why in the previous code that we just looked at, when a part of code didn't get executed because it was false, then it moved on to the next one. And then else means in any other case, execute this, which is why we got your input was 0. Here's an example of if statement in action. So if 1 is less than 2, the statement of 1 less than 2 is true. Therefore, this gets printed. So I'm getting printed because 1 is less than 2 gets printed, and then we have end. Ruby doesn't care about white space or spaces and blank lines, so the indentation of the print statement isn't necessary. By indentation it means this space here that I'm selecting. However, it's a convention that Ruby enthusiasts follow, so it's good to get in the habit now. And not just Rubyists, as it calls it here, many other programmers as well. So in Python you do have to use indentation. In C++ you don't have to, but your code would look much better if you do, because you can look through it much more easily. And it's usually, it says here 2 spaces. I would say 4 spaces or 1 tab. even though one tab is actually 8 spaces long, normally in text editors it counts as 4. So I would recommend using a tab as indentation. So when you're done with your if, you have to tell Ruby by typing end, which is why I have the end there. So instructions: write your own if statement in the editor. It can take any expression you want, even just true, but it should evaluate to true overall. When it does, it should print a string of your choice to the console using print or puts, so either one is acceptable for this case. So that if something, then we will do something, and then we need to end it. Here we will have puts, and then we'll have this just got printed. And if we can, it tells us that we can use true, you can use that, less than that, and it's going to be fine. This just got printed, gets printed out to the output console. So start new lesson, next lesson, not new lesson. Else. So we also have the else. We'll look at the if, now let's look at else. So the partner to the if statement is the else statement. An if-else statement says to Ruby, if this expression is true, run this code. But if it isn't, then run the code that's after else, because it's otherwise. It gets all of the rubbish, let's say. So if nothing good got caught by the if, everything else got caught by else, because it was bad. Well, it doesn't have to always be bad, but for an example like this, I think it works quite well. Instructions: try it yourself in the editor. Use any expression you like in your if-else statement, but make sure both branches print a string of your choice to the console. Also, another way of maybe thinking of if and else is like, you have the if is a net, and then else is a solid surface. It catches everything. I don't know, just a way of thinking about it. So let's use an if, then we will have an else, and then end. Also notice after the else here, we don't actually need to check anything, because it catches everything else. So if that, then we will have puts. This is the if statement. If I can spell statement, there we go. Puts. This is the else statement after the if statement. I don't care about spelling that much right now. I do think that I have spelled it correctly though. So if this wasn't true, then this would get printed. In this case it is true, so this is going to be printed. But let's make it false, simply by just changing the direction of that. And we get it to be false. So we will learn more about greater than and lesser than symbols in the next lesson, but for now, I think that they make sense. If this number is greater than this number, then, well, okay, so the statement of this number greater than this number is checked whether it's true or false. In this case, that statement is false, so if false, doesn't enter. Think of it like that. So you're checking whether this statement is true or false. If it's true, it enters. If it's false, it doesn't enter. And moves on to the else, like in this case. So let's move on. Else if. So this works similarly to if, and less similarly to else, I guess. So what if you want more than two options though? It's else if to the rescue. The else if statement can add any number of alternatives to an if else statement, like so. So if you think of an if as a net with big spaces, you can think of the else if as a net with smaller spaces, and then the else again as just the ground or something solid. So this code uses if, else if, and else for control flow or flow control, whichever one. Instructions: add an else if block to your if else statement in the editor. Oh, actually, this would normally get copied over. So let's copy it and let's move on. There we go. So easily we can just put else if here. Else if. And that is not how you spell else if. Neither is that. There we go. Indented there. Oops, not double indentation. Also make sure that else if goes before else, because after else is ran, that's it. Nothing else can be ran after it. So elsif, it always starts with if, then elsif, as many elsifs as you want. You can have no elsifs, you can have infinite elsifs. You don't have to have an else, but there can only ever be one else. And there can only ever be one if in this kind of chain. You can have one if after another, but that does something different. I will explain in the next section. So we have if this, then do this. Otherwise, if something, again we have to do some kind of comparison. Oops. Let's do that, but just change the orientation. Then we'll do puts. This is in the elsif, which you could also write as else if. And what this is going to do is it should print this statement, the second one. This is in the else if. Good. Start next lesson. And then you also have unless for control flow. So we have if and then we have unless, which is the opposite in a way. So sometimes you want to use control flow to check if something is false. So if it's false, then you want to run it. If it's true, you don't want to run it. So rather than if it's true, you could reverse your if else, but Ruby will do you one better. If you it will let you use an unless statement. Let's say you don't want to eat unless you're hungry. That is, while you're not hungry, you write programs or do whatever else you're doing. But if you are hungry, you eat. You might write your program in Ruby like this. So you have unless hungry, write programs. Otherwise, eat. And then you have end, as always. Instructions, we've started you off in the editor. Replace the underlines with the correct unless statement code so your program prints out I'm writing Ruby programs. So it wants us to use unless, fair enough. Shift home, unless. So unless hungry, and that is not how you spell hungry. So unless false, which means true, I'm writing Ruby programs. Else, time to eat. And then we have end at the end. So this is going to print out I'm writing Ruby programs. There we go. So you can also get the same result by using if not hungry, because not just reverses what it is given. So in this case, false, not false is true, not true is false. So we're going to get the same outcome, but it's not acceptable for Kakam here. But as you can see, we do get the same outcome. And also if you use unless, so okay, no. If you use if hungry, because hungry is false, it's not going to enter into this, so it's going to do time to eat. As you can see. To get the same result as this, you can also do unless not hungry. And it's going to do the same as just if. It really depends on your on what you want to do and your style. And for some reason, Kakam actually accept this. Don't really know why, even though it's not what they ask for. So you can run it with either one. But this is the correct code, and I will end it off with this. Actually, no, I promised to explain why you shouldn't be using one if after another. So say you have if 1 less than 2. Then you have puts high 1. Then you have end. And then you also repeat it again and again for 2 less than 3, and 3 less than 4, 4 less than 5. Okay, and let's change the number of these as well. So this is just a bit of extra things that I want to explain. So you have if 1 is less than 2, do this. And all of these are all going to be true, so all of them are actually going to be executed. You are going to get high 1, high 2, high 3, and high 4. But sometimes you only want to get one of them. So how to do that is by using if this, else if, else if, else if. You don't need an else in there. You can have an if and then an else if without an else. Because sometimes you might only want to have the first or just the second. You don't want all of your outputs to be printed out, or all of your outputs to be added onto the value, depending on what you're doing with the program. Which is why you have the elsif in there. But sometimes you might actually need this. Sometimes it might be more useful to use an if after another if. So it's just something to think about maybe. So I will delete that code, save and submit, and finish up with that. So if you guys enjoyed this video, then please give it a like, share, subscribe. If you have any questions, do feel free to ask in the comments down below. I will answer them as soon as possible. Also, I hope you enjoyed your Christmas. And yeah, until next time, thank you so much for watching and goodbye.